Okay, so we got some surprising news concerning Final Fantasy 16 and Square Enix. Apparently, Square Enix was disappointed with the sales of Final Fantasy 16 because it fell below their desired expectations. And it's been revealed that Square Enix lost $2 billion of its value due to Final Fantasy 16. So, like a lot of people are wondering whether or not this game is a commercial success or not. In terms of sales, it did good during its first week, and I believe Final Fantasy 16 came out like on the 22nd of June, and it was revealed like in late August that it did like 3 million in terms of sales. So obviously, this game I wouldn't say necessarily flopped, but at the same time, it did not have as much mainstream success as a lot of people had hoped it would have, and um, and that's kind of disappointing considering the fact that people have been waiting like 7 or 8 years for Final Fantasy 16, and I believe I've said in a previous video that it might take a while for Final Fantasy 16 to sell more than it has already. But at the same time, I mean, the Final Fantasy series isn't been as popular as it once was. It's not as big as it was in the 90s, not as big as it was during the early 2000s. A lot of people would go on record and say that around like the late 2000s onwards, the Final Fantasy series became less and less interesting, with the exception of maybe Final Fantasy 14 and 15. But the teens decade, for the most part, hasn't really been too great for the Final Fantasy series. I do feel like Final Fantasy 15 kind of saved the series to some extent. You look at Final Fantasy 16. Um, a lot of people love the fact that Square Enix decided to go back to the whole medieval theme and all that stuff. The story itself was kind of, I mean, it was interesting, but a lot of people found it kind of boring because it kind of reflects what's going on in real life or something that might happen in real life with, the blight, how that's, similar to COVID and how there might be a major war, between, nations and the world and the real world. And I don't know. I just feel like Final Fantasy 16 is just it's a game that was better than a lot of people expected, but at the same time, it wasn't a massive commercial success, because at this point, a lot of people probably thought that this game would have reached at least double than what it's already sold. And like for the most part, it seemed like, the Final Fantasy series has just been irrelevant. It's not that like no one cares about it or anything, but it's just not as big or as popular as it once was. And a lot of people is wondering what this means for Square Enix as a company, because when you think about Square Enix, one of the first things you think about is Final Fantasy and its franchise. And I think the reason why this is such a bad thing with, like, Square Enix and their like recent games not, reaching its sales expectations or anything like that is because you have companies like Capcom and Activision Blizzard that is more popular and have higher market value than Square Enix. And because of that, I mean, Square Enix could, suffer greatly if people are not buying their games or anything like that. Because when it comes down to RPGs, a lot of people will go on record and tell you that Square Enix is one of the best video game developers in relation to that genre. But it seems like 2023, for the most part, has been a very like competitive year in relation to gaming because we've got so many big games that came out this year. That's quite possible that Final Fantasy 16 simply got overshadowed. You had Street Fighter 6. You have Mortal Kombat 1 that's coming out soon. You have Diablo 4. You have Baldur's Gate 3. There's a lot of games that came out this year. And honestly, Square Enix would have been better off releasing Final Fantasy 16 in 2024 because there's not too many high profile games coming out in 2024 that I know of, probably with the exception of maybe Tekken 8. But for the most part, I do feel like if Final Fantasy 16 was released last year in 2022, it definitely would have shined more because 2022 was a lackluster year for video game releases in general. But as far as Final Fantasy 16 is concerned, I do feel that the sales has been a bit disappointing for that particular game, seeing how overhyped it was before it's released. And I'll admit, I was one of the few people who felt like this game was going to sell faster than it actually did. But I don't know, there's just been so much going on this year, and I do feel like with the Mario movie and all the games I just mentioned, and the upcoming Mario game that's supposed to be coming out next month. A lot of spotlight and attention has been taken off of the Final Fantasy series because the Final Fantasy series is not as relevant as some of the other video game series that people like, whether it be Street Fighter or whether it be Diablo or whether it be Mario or whether it be Zelda. And that's another thing, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom also came out this year as well. So it's been a crazy year in relation to video games. And that's good for a lot of, gamers worldwide, that we got so many high profile video games this year. But unfortunately, um, 2023 was probably just a bad time to release Final Fantasy 16 because you look at this game and you look at all the other games that came out this year. This game looks kind of boring in comparison to those games. And not only that, it kind of feels like the Final Fantasy series to some extent has lost its identity because it looks and started to feel more and more generic as the series goes by, because back in the day the Final Fantasy series stood out and it had its own identity, and it was something that allowed you to distinguish its games from its competitors, whether it be in the RPG genre or what have you. But um but it seems like, the Final Fantasy series is not what it used to be, which is why Square Enix, they like to remake their old games because they know that there are more casuals who are familiar with the older installments of the Final Fantasy series. And when it comes to the more recent titles, they're not as interested you know, as they would be in a Final Fantasy VII remake. And the same thing can be said with Capcom and the Resident Evil series. A lot of people feel like the older Resident Evil games, like, 2, 3, and 4, were the best. And, they jumped at the announcement of a remake of that. And as far as the more recent like Resident Evil games are concerned, people liked Biohazard, and I remember when Five first came out, there was a bit of controversy concerning Five, but at the same time, critics had good things to say about it. Um, there were a lot of people who didn't like Resident Evil 6 for whatever reason, but it just goes to show you. I'm just using that as an example to basically show that for whatever reason, people like the older stuff a lot better. It's not that the newer stuff is not good. It's just that, people seem to love nostalgia, and and they like to see remakes of certain games that people played when like it had a larger fan base. And I'm starting to think that that might be the case to some extent with Final Fantasy, where maybe the series has a lapsed fan base, and maybe not as many people are interested in the franchise as they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. But at the same time, Final Fantasy 16 is not a bad game, but I do feel that it's definitely not close to being one of the more popular installments in the series either.